The ER at Metropolitan General buzzed with the usual after-midnight chaos when Elena Williams stepped through the sliding doors, one hand pressed tightly to her belly, the other gripping the counter to stay upright. 8 months pregnant and trembling from a sudden wave of sharp pain, she whispered for help, her voice nearly drowned by the hum of fluorescent lights. Behind the desk sat Nurse Valerie Brooks, a woman whose posture alone signaled she believed the entire ER moved according to her will. With crisp scrubs, narrowed eyes, and an expression carved from equal parts exhaustion and bitterness, she looked Elena over as though assessing a nuisance, not a patient in distress. Elena tried again, soft, polite, frightened, explaining she thought she might be bleeding and needed someone to check the baby, but Valerie barely lifted her gaze, muttering that people exaggerate every little twinge to skip the line. The words stung almost as much as the pain twisting through Elena's back. She had already been waiting for more than an hour, hunched in a plastic chair, fighting the rising dread that something was seriously wrong. But when she approached the desk again, desperate for any sign of care, Valerie's expression hardened. She stood, towering over Elena with an air of authority sharpened by resentment, insisting Elena was not an emergency and accusing her of dramatic behavior meant to get attention. The waiting room went still. Even the coughing old man in the corner paused to stare. Elena, still trying to remain respectful, explained she wasn't trying to cut ahead, only to protect her baby. That small plea, gentle, cracking with fear, ignited something darker in Valerie. With a suddenness that shocked everyone, Valerie struck Elena across the face, a sharp motion born of frustration rather than medical judgment. Elena staggered, gripping a nearby chair to keep from falling, her other hand instinctively shielding her stomach. Gasps rippled across the room, phones lifted, and the quiet dignity Elena carried with her began to crumble under the weight of humiliation and panic. Dr. Naomi Clark appeared at the edge of the room, alarmed by the raised voices, but Valerie immediately cut her off, insisting Elena was overreacting and that the doctor should focus on real emergencies. Naomi hesitated, torn between training and fear of jeopardizing her evaluation under Valerie's supervision. Meanwhile, Security Officer Marcus Trent hovered nearby, unsure whether intervening would cost him his job. Elena, now shaking, whispered that her husband worked for the city and she had full insurance, hoping it might finally prompt help. Yet Valerie scoffed at that too, dismissing Elena with a condescending laugh. Another surge of pain hit, stronger and deeper than before, and Elena felt a faint rush of warmth she knew wasn't normal. Her knees weakened. She pleaded once more, not with anger, but with the quiet desperation of someone terrified for her child, begging for just 5 minutes with a doctor. Valerie refused again, her tone sharp enough to cut through any remaining hope. She accused Elena of causing a scene, announcing to the entire room that some people think pregnancy makes them entitled. Phones now recorded openly. Whispers filled the air as Valerie doubled down, using her authority like a shield, insisting she knew exactly what type of woman Elena was. Another contraction tore through Elena's body, pulling her forward, making her vision blur at the edges. Valerie noticed but refused to accept it as real, repeating that Elena was performing. Finally, Elena's trembling hands reached into her pocket for her phone. With a voice barely audible, she called her husband. "James, I need you. Something's wrong." He answered instantly, and though Elena couldn't see his expression, she could hear the steel in his voice as he told her not to move and not to let anyone touch her until he arrived. She hung up, breathing through the pain, unaware that the moment James Williams, the mayor of the entire city, received that call, the entire direction of the night was about to shift. Outside, the sky remained dark, silent, unaware of the human storm brewing inside the hospital. Inside, Valerie Brooks continued her tirade, completely unaware that her actions had just set in motion a chain of consequences that would reach far beyond the walls of the ER. And Elena Williams, her cheeks still throbbing, her baby still unexamined, whispered a small prayer that the man she loved would arrive before something irreversible happened. The waiting room had barely settled back into its uneasy silence when the distant echo of hurried footsteps broke through the tension, growing louder until the sliding doors flew open with a gust of cold morning air. Entering first was a man with an expression so focused, so commanding, that everyone instinctively straightened. His tailored coat, the security detail flanking him, and the unmistakable confidence in his stride made the entire ER freeze. It was only when his gaze locked onto Elena, still seated, clutching her stomach, that several staff members recognized him. Mayor James Williams, the same man whose face appeared on every news broadcast, stood at the entrance of the very hospital his wife had just accused of neglecting her. Valerie Brooks blinked, confused for a moment, then stepped forward demanding that he respect visiting hours, as if her authority could outweigh the panic in his eyes. James didn't even acknowledge her at first. He moved straight toward Elena, kneeling beside her trembling form, reaching for her hand with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the steel hardening his jaw. "I'm here now," he whispered, then turned to face the room, his tone shifting into something colder, sharper. Only then did he address Valerie. "Where is the doctor responsible for my wife's care?" he asked, his voice low but carrying the force of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. Valerie, still struggling to regain her footing, scoffed that his wife had been disruptive and that she was handling things according to protocol. Her words, however, collided with the growing crowd of witnesses stepping forward, phones still recording. A young mother spoke up shakily, saying she saw Valerie slap Elena. Julio, the janitor, added that Elena had begged repeatedly for help. Even Officer Trent admitted he had been instructed not to intervene. The room seemed to close in on Valerie as she tried to argue back, insisting she had been provoked, but every attempt only deepened the silence around her. Meanwhile, James looked at Dr. Naomi Clark, who had hovered nervously nearby, and his expression softened slightly. "Doctor," he said, "tell me honestly, has my wife received any medical assessment tonight?" Naomi swallowed hard, shaking her head. "No, sir. She should have," she reported, bleeding. The confession landed like a blow. Valerie lunged to interrupt, claiming the doctor was mistaken, insisting Elena had exaggerated symptoms. But Naomi stood straighter this time, courage rising in her voice as she said, "I heard her report bleeding. I heard her ask for help." That moment shattered the last of the illusion Valerie had built. Even hospital administrators, alerted by frantic calls, rushed in wearing half-buttoned coats, their faces draining of color as they took in the scene. The pregnant woman in distress, the mayor furious, and the entire waiting room bearing witness. James rose slowly, turning his full attention to Valerie. "You refused care to my wife," he said quietly. "And you struck her?" Valerie's face went pale as she stammered that she didn't know who Elena was. His answer was thunderous in its simplicity. "You didn't need to know who she was. You only needed to know she was a human being in pain." The administrator ordered Valerie suspended on the spot, demanding security escort her away for investigation. But Valerie resisted, insisting she had seniority, claiming the witnesses were mistaken, insisting everything was taken out of context. Yet each denial made the room feel heavier, as if the entire staff had reached a breaking point after years of silent tolerance. Meanwhile, Naomi signaled that Elena's contractions were becoming dangerously close together, and the need for immediate intervention was clear. As orderlies rushed forward with a gurney, James helped guide Elena onto it, whispering reassurances while stroking her hair, though his own hands were trembling with barely contained fear. Cameras from the arriving news crew caught everything. Valerie's panic, the mayor's protective urgency, and the ring of witnesses determined to expose the truth. In the hallway, as Elena was wheeled toward the delivery area, she clung to James's hand and whispered, "Please don't let her hurt anyone else." James leaned down, kissed her forehead, and said, "I won't. Not tonight. Not ever again." Behind them, security finally escorted Valerie out the door, her protests fading into the sterile hum of the ER she once ruled. What she didn't yet know was that the videos already circulating online were igniting outrage across the city, setting in motion a storm she would not be able to outrun. In the days that followed the chaotic night at Metropolitan General, the city buzzed with outrage as footage of Nurse Valerie's treatment of Elena spread across every platform, sparking debates on discrimination in healthcare. What began as a single incident quickly unraveled into something far larger once the mayor's office ordered a full investigation into the hospital's emergency room practices. Elena, now resting at home with her newborn daughter Amina, tiny but fighting strong, watched the news unfold with a mix of disbelief and emotional exhaustion. She never wanted attention. She only wanted her baby safe. Yet the city seemed unable to look away from the injustice she had endured. Investigators flooded the hospital, combing through years of videos, staff schedules, patient logs, and internal complaints. It wasn't long before troubling patterns emerged. Under Valerie's supervision, the wait times for Black and Hispanic patients were consistently longer than those of white patients with similar symptoms. Complaints from minority families had been dismissed or labeled as misunderstandings, many never reaching upper management. Doctors who once remained silent out of fear began stepping forward. Former residents admitted that Valerie had threatened their schedules and evaluations whenever they questioned her triage decisions. Nurse assistants described being scolded for prioritizing patients Valerie considered not urgent based on appearance rather than medical need. Even the janitorial staff, often overlooked, revealed they had witnessed repeated dismissals of patients in distress but lacked the authority to intervene. Julio, the night janitor, became an unexpected center of the investigation after sharing years of observations, recounting how he had seen minority patients endure disrespect yet felt powerless to challenge a senior nurse. His voice, once ignored, now echoed on local news broadcasts, giving the public a clearer picture of just how long the problem had been festering. Dr. Naomi Clark also stepped into the spotlight. With a newfound sense of responsibility, she admitted that she had kept silent out of fear for her career, a truth that made her testimony all the more powerful. She described moments when she felt morally torn, moments when she wanted to intervene, but knew Valerie held influence over her evaluations. Her honesty ignited conversations nationwide about the power imbalances embedded in hospital hierarchies. As more evidence surfaced, it became clear that the issue was systemic, not isolated. Administrators scrambled to explain how so many warning signs had been overlooked, citing understaffing and chaotic environments. But the public was no longer satisfied with excuses. Protesters gathered outside the hospital demanding accountability, holding signs that read, "Healthcare should heal, not harm, and every patient deserves dignity." Meanwhile, federal investigators joined the inquiry, revealing years of ignored complaints and outdated protocols that allowed bias to thrive unchecked. Even the hospital board, clearly embarrassed, issued public apologies and promised sweeping reforms. Elena watched these developments with a heavy heart. She appreciated that people were finally speaking out, but part of her grieved that so many had suffered quietly before she ever stepped into the ER. She still woke from sleep sometimes with her heart racing, remembering Valerie's cold stare and the sharp sting of humiliation more than the slap itself. Yet she also felt a quiet strength growing inside her, a sense that her experience was becoming a catalyst for something bigger than she ever imagined. James held her every night, assuring her that justice wasn't revenge but transformation. He attended back-to-back meetings, working with city leaders to ensure real change, not temporary outrage. Every time he stepped onto the podium for a press briefing, he spoke not as a politician but as a husband who saw his wife's fear and vowed no one else would endure the same. Meanwhile, Valerie, suspended and under investigation, watched her once solid reputation crumble. Her lawyer insisted she was being unfairly targeted, but the mounting evidence painted a harsh picture, one not easily dismissed. As news outlets uncovered past disciplinary warnings ignored by supervisors, the narrative shifted from a nurse's mistake to a symptom of a broken system. By the end of the third week, the hospital announced immediate restructuring of the ER leadership, mandatory bias training, and a new independent review panel. The investigation's interim report sent shockwaves through the city, declaring that discrimination had been allowed to operate unchecked through culture, not policy. Elena held Amina close as she read the report's findings, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and hope. She hadn't asked to be the face of reform, but the truth was undeniable. Her voice had helped crack open a system many believed untouchable. And though the road ahead was long, one thing was certain: the city would never look at its hospitals the same way again. The courthouse steps overflowed with reporters, activists, and anxious onlookers the morning Valerie Brooks faced her first day in court, a stark contrast to the quiet authority she once wielded in the ER. Inside the packed courtroom, the air buzzed with a mixture of tension and anticipation as the public prepared to witness the outcome of a case that had ignited national conversations about healthcare discrimination. Elena sat near the front with James, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she tried to steady her breathing. Though months had passed since the night Amina was born, the memory of that fear lingered in her body like a bruise that refused to fade. When Valerie entered, escorted by her attorneys, the room shifted. She looked smaller than the domineering figure who had towered over Elena in the ER. Her shoulders curled inward, her gaze fixed on the ground, the confidence stripped away by weeks of public scrutiny. The judge opened the proceedings, and the prosecutor wasted no time setting the tone, describing Valerie's actions not as a single lapse, but as part of a long pattern of discriminatory behavior that endangered vulnerable patients. The first evidence shown was the video footage captured by waiting room witnesses. The moment Valerie slapped Elena played across the courtroom monitors, freezing the room into breathless silence. Elena closed her eyes, hearing the faint gasp ripple through the audience as the footage replayed. Valerie's attorney stood to argue context, that she had been overwhelmed, that Elena had been aggressive, that the situation had been misinterpreted, but the excuse faltered under the weight of visual truth. Next came testimony. Dr. Naomi Clark approached the stand, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice clearer than ever. She described how Elena had reported bleeding, how she had tried to intervene, and how Valerie had threatened her career if she continued. Her honesty struck the courtroom deeply, exposing not only Valerie's misconduct, but also the toxic power imbalance that had enabled it. Then came Julio, the janitor whose quiet courage had become symbolic of the case. He recounted years of witnessing subtle and overt discrimination, from delayed care to dismissive remarks to unnecessary scolding of minority patients. He explained how powerless he had felt, how hospital policies silenced people like him, and how the public's response to Elena's story finally gave him the courage to speak. His voice cracked as he told the court, if someone had listened earlier, maybe none of this would have happened. The defense attempted to discredit him, but the jury saw through it. Julio spoke with the raw sincerity of someone who had carried heavy truths for too long. Several former patients testified too, recalling experiences where Valerie dismissed symptoms or treated them with disdain. Though each account differed, the pattern was unmistakable. Valerie's attorney argued she was being scapegoated for a broken system, that other staff failed to step in, that she had been under extraordinary pressure. But even those points only reinforced the prosecutor's claim. Valerie had used her position not to help but to harm. When the time came for Elena to speak, the courtroom fell into an almost sacred silence. She rose slowly, walked to the stand, and looked directly at Valerie, not with anger, but with a deep, steadying sadness. She described her fear that night, her belief that something was wrong with her baby, and the humiliation of being denied basic care when she needed it most. Her voice remained calm, yet every word carried the weight of lived trauma. I never expected special treatment, she said softly. I only wanted to be seen as a person, to be treated with the dignity every patient deserves. Valerie's eyes filled with tears, but whether with guilt or self-pity, no one could tell. The closing arguments drew the case into sharp focus. The prosecutor emphasized that Valerie's authority had come with moral responsibility, one she chose to abuse, while the defense pleaded for leniency, citing Valerie's years of service. But when the jury returned after only a few hours of deliberation, the verdict was clear: guilty on multiple counts, including negligence, assault, and civil rights violations. A collective exhale swept through the room. Elena felt her chest loosen for the first time in months. James wrapped an arm around her, whispering that justice had taken its first step. Valerie sank into her chair, defeated, the reality settling in that the consequences she once thought she could avoid had now arrived with undeniable force. As the judge announced that sentencing would take place in 30 days, the courtroom emptied slowly, leaving behind the echo of a moment that would redefine not just a hospital, but the entire city's expectations of fairness in healthcare. Outside, cameras flashed as James addressed the public, reminding them that the goal was not punishment alone, but transformation. And while the fight was far from over, Elena felt for the first time that healing had finally begun. The weeks following the trial transformed the city in ways no one could have predicted, as the verdict against Valerie Brooks sparked a wave of reforms across Metropolitan General and beyond. When sentencing day arrived, the courtroom was quieter than before, almost reverent, as the judge delivered an 18-month prison term, permanent revocation of Valerie's nursing license, and mandatory bias education. Valerie stood trembling, no longer defiant, but hollow, absorbing the reality that her years of unchecked authority had finally carried consequences she could no longer outrun. Outside the courthouse, journalists reported not only the sentence but the wider change her actions had accelerated. James, determined to turn his family's ordeal into meaningful progress, began drafting legislation to ensure no patient would again face discrimination behind hospital doors. What emerged was the Williams Healthcare Equity Act, a bill mandating transparent reporting of patient wait times by race, anonymous avenues for staff to report biased behavior, and independent oversight committees in every major hospital. As City Council unanimously voted to pass the act, applause thundered across the chamber, and dozens of patients, past and present, stood in tears, knowing the system had finally been forced to confront its failures. Meanwhile, Metropolitan General underwent a transformation unlike anything in its century-long history. The board removed several administrators who had ignored warning signs for years, replacing them with leaders committed to equity and accountability. Dr. Naomi Clark, whose testimony had exposed the power structures that silenced residents, was promoted to interim chief of emergency medicine. Her first directive was simple yet monumental. Every patient deserves dignity, and every voice deserves to be heard. She introduced a new triage system designed to eliminate subjective decision-making, focusing solely on medical urgency. Training programs taught staff how bias, conscious or unconscious, can affect judgment. Walls once silent now displayed posters reminding everyone that empathy is as vital as expertise. The atmosphere of fear that once defined the night shift dissolved, replaced by a sense of shared purpose among doctors, nurses, technicians, and custodians. One of the most unexpected changes came through Julio, the janitor whose testimony resonated deeply with the public. Recognizing his courage, the hospital offered him a new role as a patient support liaison, a position allowing him to advocate for those who felt overlooked. Julio accepted with tears in his eyes, understanding that he no longer had to watch injustice quietly. His presence became a symbol of the hospital's new direction. Every role mattered, every voice counted. Across the city, other hospitals followed suit, updating their policies, improving transparency, and offering staff new channels to report concerns without fear. The ripple effect extended to medical schools, nursing programs, and even state-level healthcare boards, all acknowledging the need for stronger protections against bias. Meanwhile, Elena slowly navigated her own path toward healing. Caring for baby Amina brought moments of profound gratitude, though memories of that night still surfaced unexpectedly whenever she smelled disinfectant or when a sudden sharp noise made her heart skip. Therapy helped, as did the steady support of James, who never missed a single appointment, reminding her she wasn't alone. She often wondered how many women before her had endured similar experiences quietly, without support or justice. That thought fueled her desire to speak publicly about the need for compassionate care. When she finally agreed to attend a community forum on patient rights, her voice trembled only for the first few minutes. Then something shifted. She saw the faces of women nodding in recognition, families who had felt invisible in the healthcare system, and she realized her pain had become a bridge to hope for others. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone seeking change. While Valerie began her sentence in a minimum security facility, the hospital world outside moved forward without her. She attended mandatory classes on cultural sensitivity and wrote apology letters to several former patients, though some chose not to accept them. In her quiet moments, sitting alone in a bare prison common room, she replayed the night of Elena's arrival over and over, finally seeing her own cruelty without the shield of authority to justify it. In rare interviews, she admitted she wished someone had confronted her years earlier. "I didn't realize how cold I'd become," she said once. "Power made me forget what compassion felt like." The city, however, continued its transformation. Community leaders reported increased trust in emergency rooms, and early data suggested shorter wait time disparities and improved patient satisfaction across all demographics. But the most visible sign of change appeared inside Metropolitan General's main lobby, where a plaque was installed reading, "In honor of every patient who deserved dignity. Let this hospital never forget its responsibility to protect it." Elena visited the plaque quietly one morning with Amina in her arms, running her fingers over the engraved words. The past still hurt, but the future no longer felt frightening. As she walked through the halls, staff who once rushed past now greeted her warmly. A few nurses thanked her for speaking up, admitting the reforms had empowered them in ways they never imagined. For the first time since that terrible night, Elena felt something heavy lift from her. Her voice had mattered. Her trauma had not been in vain. And though there was more work ahead, this moment, this hospital transformed, was proof that justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about building something better in its place. 6 months after the night that changed everything, the Williams home felt warmer and brighter than it had in a long time, sunlight spilling across the living room floor as baby Amina giggled in her mother's arms. Elena had healed slowly, not just physically but emotionally, finding strength in the tiny fingers that curled around hers each morning. The city around them had transformed as well, and a documentary crew arrived to capture the story that had sparked unprecedented reform. At first, Elena felt hesitant as cameras entered her home, but as she settled onto the couch with Amina on her lap and James by her side, she understood the importance of telling the truth, not for attention, but for the people still living in fear of mistreatment. When the interviewer asked how life had changed since the incident, Elena inhaled deeply, remembering the humiliation, the pain, the desperate plea for help. But she also remembered the courage of those who had stepped forward, the unity of strangers in the waiting room, the reforms that now protected thousands of patients. She explained how trust in the healthcare system had been restored through transparency, new training programs, and the creation of unbiased triage protocols. Across the city, she said, patients now felt seen, heard, and respected. James added that the Williams Healthcare Equity Act had become a blueprint for other states, with over half the country adopting similar legislation. Hospitals reported steady improvements, shorter wait time disparities, more equitable treatment, and new accountability models that encouraged staff to intervene when they witnessed unethical behavior. Meanwhile, Metropolitan General had evolved into a national example of compassionate care. Posters lining the hallways reminded staff of the hospital's pledge to uphold dignity, and the lobby's dedication plaque had become a quiet place where visitors paused to reflect. Dr. Naomi Clark settled into her role as Chief of Emergency Medicine, leading with empathy and fairness. Under her leadership, medical residents felt empowered to question and learn without fear. The night shift, once overshadowed by Valerie's authority, now operated with teamwork and respect, proving that culture can be rebuilt when the right people guide it. Julio, once invisible despite his years of service, thrived in his new role as patient liaison. The documentary captured him walking through the ER, comforting nervous families and advocating for those confused by medical forms or long waits. In one touching scene, he explained that after years of mopping floors in silence, he finally felt he could make a difference. "Everyone deserves someone in their corner," he said proudly, his eyes glistening. But the documentary did not focus only on success. It also reflected on Valerie's imprisonment. The filmmakers interviewed experts who said her case had become a lesson in unchecked bias, how power, when combined with prejudice, can slip into cruelty if ignored. Valerie herself, speaking briefly from the facility where she served her sentence, admitted regret, acknowledging that she had allowed frustration to cloud her judgment and dehumanize the very people she was supposed to protect. Her fate served as a solemn reminder that accountability reaches everyone, regardless of position or tenure. As the cameras returned to the Williams home, Elena lifted Amina, kissing her forehead gently. She explained that her daughter's birth story, though painful, had become a symbol of resilience and hope. The interviewer asked if she ever wished the night had unfolded differently. Elena paused, then answered softly, "I wish no mother had to experience what I did. But if my story helped even one person get the care they deserve, then something good grew from something terrible." She described being approached in grocery stores, community events, even church services by families who had once felt invisible but now felt seen. Her advocacy work expanded, leading her to speak at medical schools and community centers. She never spoke with anger, only honesty, encouraging healthcare providers to remember the humanity in every patient who walked through their doors. James closed the documentary by addressing viewers directly. With the poised authority of a mayor and the tenderness of a husband, he explained that change happens when ordinary people refuse to stay silent. My wife wasn't powerful that night, he said. She wasn't the mayor's wife. She was a patient in danger, and someone chose to ignore her humanity. Never assume anyone is powerless. Everyone deserves respect. The final scenes showed the city's hospitals bustling with life, patients smiling as nurses greeted them warmly, doctors conferring respectfully with staff, and families sitting in waiting rooms that now felt safe, not intimidating. And in the last frame, Elena carried Amina through the ER's remodeled hallway, passing the plaque that honored every patient who had ever been dismissed or overlooked. She touched the cool metal gently before whispering to her daughter, "This is why your story matters." As she stepped back into the sunlight, it was clear that her family had not only survived injustice, they had reshaped the future.